quarter three. To do the presentation is the government statistician, Dr. Alasa Idrisu, GGS. GGS, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be with you once again. I welcome you to the presentation of Ghana's multidimensional poverty statistics, covering 2024 quarter one through 2025 quarter three. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just another statistical report. It's a mirror of everyday life in Ghana. In fact, the report speaks directly to Ghana's national development priorities, which focuses on protecting livelihoods, expanding opportunity, strengthening social protection outcomes, and building a more productive and inclusive economy. It also supports the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 1, to end poverty, and also a promise to leave no one behind. The report tells us with evidence where we are making some progress, where hardship is still deep, and where policy actions must be faster, smarter, and also more targeted. As we know, poverty is not only about income. It's about whether people can live with dignity through access to decent housing, safe sanitation, quality education, healthcare, and stable work. That's what this report measures, and that's why this matters a lot. So today, I will take you through this report in a very clear and practical way, so that every Ghanaian, whether you are a worker, whether you are an employer, policymaker, investor, student, or community leader, can understand what the numbers mean and what we must do next. But let's start with the basics. Multidimensional poverty means a person is poor, not only because they have low income, but because they face several disadvantages or deprivations at the same time. For example, imagine a household that has no decent toilet, uses unsafe water, cannot afford health insurance, has children missing in school, or children missing school, let me put it like that, and no one has stable work in that household. That household is facing poverty in multi-directions at once. And this is what we refer to as multi-dimensional poverty. So Ghana's multi-dimensional poverty index is actually built around 4 key dimensions. And the dimensions are living conditions, health, education, and employment. And across these 4 dimensions, we have 13 indicators, or what we call deprivations. In very simple terms, these indicators ask, are people living in safe and decent housing? Are they overcrowded? Do they have electricity? Do they have a toilet? Do they have health insurance? Are children attending school? Are people employed? This gives us a fuller picture of well-being. This is especially relevant to the 24-hour economy program because that agenda requires continuous monitoring of jobs and livelihoods, household welfare, access to basic services, and inequality across region. Now let me explain the method that we employed in very simple terms. We used data from 2 major national surveys: the Annual Household Income and Expenditure Survey, what we usually refer to as AHIS, and the Quarterly Labor Force Survey, what we usually refer to as QLFS. These surveys cover representative households across all 16 regions of the country. We apply what is called the Alkaya-Foster method. But let me explain that in a very simple way. It simply means we count how many deprivations a person faces and how serious those deprivations are. In Ghana's multidimensional poverty index, a person is classified as multidimensionally poor if they are deprived in at least 1/3 of the indicators I talked about, of the 13 indicators. So if we have them exhibiting 1/3 of those indicators, then we classify that person as being multidimensionally poor. So it is not one problem. It is multiple problems happening at the same time. Now the results. You are waiting for the results. So let's jump straight into it. Now we will see that the story is mixed. We have good news for you, and we also have news which are not too palatable. There is progress nationally, but there are still deep inequalities by region, by rural and urban location, and by the social and economic situation of households. Let's begin with the incidence of multidimensional poverty. Now, and that's the most important indicator. The incidence of multidimensional poverty means what proportion of the population is poor in multiple ways. In 2025, quarter one, the incidence was 23.9%. What does this mean? This means that 23.9% of the population were multidimensionally poor in quarter one of 2025. In 2025, quarter two, the incidence reduced to 23.1%. And in 2025, quarter three, it further declined to 21.9%. So this means that the incidence of multidimensional poverty declined from 23.9% in quarter one of 2025 to 21.9% in quarter three of 2025. Compared with 2024, Ghana's multidimensional poverty indicators improved in 2025. The national poverty incidence fell from 24.9% in 2024 quarter four to 21.9% by 2025 quarter three, confirming a steady decline. And between quarter two and quarter three of 2025, the multidimensionally poor population reduced by a little over 360,000 people. So in other words, between quarter two and quarter three of 2025, we had a little over 360,000 people exiting out of multidimensional poverty. Within a period of 1 year, that is between quarter three of 2024 and quarter three of 2025, about 950,000 people moved out of multidimensional poverty. That is significant. It tells us that overall living conditions are improving, but the drivers remain largely the same, whether we are talking about 2024 or 2025. And here we are talking about health and living conditions, especially health insurance coverage, nutrition, overcrowding, and sanitation continue to be the biggest pressure points. But we must not celebrate too early because progress is not evenly shared. Now let's look at the incidence by region. That's where we're able to determine whether in every region we see this progress or not. When we break it down by region, the inequality becomes very clear. In quarter two and quarter three of 2025, the Northeast and Savannah regions recorded poverty incidence of above 50%. So let's put it in context. If at the end of quarter three of 2025, we are dealing with multidimensional poverty of 21.9%, and you have two regions which are recording above 50%, that is above the national average, that's a problem. And so, yes, we've seen some progress with multidimensional poverty coming down, but the progress is not even. You have regions which are recording way higher than the national average of 21.9%. That means that more than half of the people in these regions are deprived in multiple basic needs. Now, let's come back to Greater Accra, where we are in now, and also Western region. If you look at the data shows that multidimensional poverty incidence in these two regions remain below 20%. So whilst we have some regions that are recording multidimensional poverty incidence of above 50%, at the same time, we have regions that are recording below 20%. So that is where we see the inequality. This tells us something very important. It tells us that poverty in Ghana is not only about individuals. It is also about geography. Where you live can strongly shape your chances in life. And it means also that our policies must be region-specific and not one-size-fits-all. Now let's look at poverty incidence by type of locality. So in other words, let's compare what is happening in the urban areas and also in the rural centers. In Q3 of 2025, rural poverty was about 32% compared to urban poverty, which is about 14%. The gap is about 18 percentage points, and that's very wide. So again, you can see big disparity between what is happening in the rural settings and what is happening in the urban settings. So yes, the national poverty rate is declining, but rural Ghana is still carrying the heavier burden. If we want inclusive growth, rural development must be treated as a national priority and not as an afterthought. Let's look at multi-dimensionally poor populations by region. Now, beyond the percentages we have just seen, it's important to also look at the number of people affected. The data reveals a very important outcome. Now, we've seen that some regions have the highest poverty rate. We've seen that. But other regions also have the highest number of poor people, even though they may have relatively lower poverty rates. And this is because those regions are usually highly populated and have concentrated deprivations. So for example, if we take Q3 2025, Ashanti and Eastern regions, which recorded poverty rates around the national average, each recorded over 1 million multidimensionally poor persons. And you see that the over 1 million is extreme, when others are recording 250,000, etc. We have Ashanti region and Eastern region recording over 1 million. Meanwhile, the Ashanti region is one of the regions that recorded the lower poverty rates. So if you are dealing with poverty, or you are trying to address poverty issues, you need to balance two things. First, you need to look at those with high incidence. That's the regions that have high incidence. And secondly, you need to look at high population burden regions so that your solution or the solution that we would be implementing will be all-encompassing. That is how we target efficiently. Now let's look at contributions of the key dimensions to poverty. Earlier, I had mentioned that there are 4 key dimensions. Here we are talking about health, we are talking about living conditions, we are talking about education, and we are talking about employment. And when we say contribution to poverty, we are looking at which of these factors drive poverty the most. That's what we mean by contribution. The multidimensional poverty index, as I said, has these 4 outcomes. In Q3 of 2025, health contributed the largest share to multidimensional poverty at 40.9%, followed by living conditions at 33.8%, followed by education at 13%, and employment at 12.3%. So even though in each of these dimensions, we weighted them equally, but in terms of contributions to poverty, we are seeing that the one that contributes the most to poverty are the deprivations that are related to health, followed by what? Living conditions, followed by education, and then employment. So each dimension, as I said, has a number of indicators or deprivations. Indicators or deprivations are the specific problems households face. So just to give you a flavor of it, if you take the health indicators, for example, we are talking about, the health dimension, for example, we are talking about indicators that include nutrition and then also health insurance. If you take living conditions as a dimension, the indicators there include sanitation, electricity, water, housing quality, overcrowding, cooking fuel, and assets. And if you take education as a dimension, we are looking at school attendance, years of schooling or school attainment, and then we are looking at schooling lag. And then the employment dimension has only one indicator, which is employed. It is important to know that the indicators that are contributing the most to poverty, if one is addressing poverty, are the ones that you should be looking at, so that once we address them, then their contribution to poverty then reduces. The data show that if we improve living conditions and we improve health access, poverty will fall faster. And in fact, it's very clear from the data. Now, if you have health alone contributing about 40.9% to poverty, and living conditions alone contributing about 34% to poverty, then the two combined, you have about 34% and 40%, over 70% are from these two indicators. And so when you are tackling poverty, it means that in Ghana here, you have to look at the health indicators and the living conditions indicators. That doesn't mean that the other deprivations or indicators under the other dimensions, namely education and employment, should not be considered. Now let's look at contributions of the various indicators to multidimensional poverty. In quarter 3 of 2025, two indicators stood out very strongly. First, health insurance deprivation, affecting 26.5% of multidimensionally poor people in Ghana. Secondly, nutrition deprivation, which is affecting 14.4% of the multidimensionally poor, although it dropped from 20.3% in quarter 2 of 2025. If you look at employment deprivation, we saw an increase from 9.7% in quarter 2 of 2025 to 12.3% in quarter 3, alongside school attendance deprivation and overcrowding, signaling growing pressures outside the health dimension. So a major part of the poverty in Ghana is still about basic dignity. Access to health protection, access to good food, employment, and decent sanitation are very important indicators we must watch. Note that poverty traps households in many ways. In fact, if you do not have a toilet, your health suffers. If you do not have health insurance, sickness becomes financial shock. When sickness hits, work suffers. And when work suffers, children's schooling suffers. So it's an iterative combination of deprivations that really hits households very, very hard if you don't address one or two or more of these deprivations. Now let's look at household headship and how that affects poverty in Ghana. In quarter 3 of 2025, poverty among male-headed households was 21.9%, down from 23.6% in quarter 2. Female-headed households was 22%. So in other words, it's almost the same as the male-headed households, because 21.9% and 22% are almost the same. So the difference is very, very small. But what it tells us is that poverty remains persistent across both groups, and female-headed households may face vulnerabilities that require targeted support, especially in employment and income security. Now, education also shows one of the strongest patterns in this report. In quarter 3 of 2025, the data shows that households whose heads had no formal education had poverty incidence of 38.5%. Again, the way you should visualize this is to compare it to the national average. If nationwide, you're talking about incidence of 21.9%, and you have households whose heads had no formal indication recording incidence of 38.5%, that's high. Similarly, household whose heads, let me not say similarly, but I'm talking about the opposite. So here, household whose heads had tertiary education, if you look at the graph, had poverty incidence of 5.7%. See, the difference is very wide. If you have no formal education, then the poverty is what? 38.5. Tertiary education headed households, poverty is what? 5.7. So the difference is very, very, very high. So that tells you the importance of education. And it's not just about tertiary. I mean, if you look in the data, you will see that even post-secondary education, they record lower poverty rates, 12.9%. Even if you take secondary education, lower poverty rates, 13.1%. So the question, so the outcome here is telling us that education really matters for poverty reduction. So that's so basically the gap you are seeing is very, very huge. So what does that mean? It means that education is not just a certificate. So when we are taking you to school, it's not just to go and get a certificate, but it's actually what? Protection. So that's a very, very important thing to note. Education increases your chances of stable work. It improves health choices. It improves household decision making. And also breaks intergenerational poverty, as the data is showing. So if you want poverty reduction that lasts, education remains very central. Now let's look at employment and how it affects poverty. The data shows that employment type matters a lot. Households headed by the unemployed, actually recorded the highest poverty, reaching 35.6% in quarter 3 of 2025 from 31.9% in quarter 2. So those who are not working, the poverty rates are very high. And we are talking about 35.6% in quarter 3. If you compare this to those who are in the private informal sector, they also recorded very high poverty rates, but they were below. That's around 22%. Now, once again, a very important revelation is coming out of this study. Households headed by public sector workers recorded much lower poverty rates and even declined to 5.3% in quarter 3. So whilst we have households headed by household heads who are not working, recording poverty of 35.6%. If you have a household that's headed by somebody who is working in the public sector, like Mr. Francis Brightmaster, who is seated at my right-hand side, the poverty rate reduces to what? 5.3%. The difference is very, very sharp. In fact, it's not just the public sector. If you look at private formal sector, if it's even lower, it's about 5%. So in other words, I know the media guys are in private formal, right? So the poverty rate, among the group they belong to, is even lower than the public sector. But I mean, on a more serious note, the point we are trying to make is that there's a big difference between working and not working, and that households that are headed by people who are not working experience very high poverty rates, and those that are headed by people who are working experience relatively lower poverty rates. So what this tells us is that stable jobs reduce poverty, and informal and insecure work increases vulnerability. So job creation is not enough. We need decent jobs. That's why usually when the labor unions are calling for some progress in the labor space, they're not just talking about jobs, but they're talking about what? Decent jobs. And the study we have done actually shows that decent jobs are extremely important. And also stable jobs. and also productive jobs. Now let's look at poverty by economic sector of the household head. The data shows that poverty was highest among households where the head is not working, as I mentioned earlier, 35.6%, but also where the head is in agriculture. So if the head is in agriculture, the poverty rate is 32.1%, but we are seeing some progress. Previously, in quarter 2, the poverty rate was 34%, and in quarter 3, it came down to 32.1%. But it was far lower in industry. So in other words, if the household is headed by somebody working in industry, the poverty rate was around 9.8%. And if the household is headed by someone in services, the poverty rate was around 9.7%. This shows that agriculture remains a major poverty risk area which we have to address. So in other words, we need to identify the risks there and ensure that we are mitigating the impact of those risks so that agriculture rather reduces poverty for the development of the country. So if Ghana wants to reduce poverty, we must modernize agriculture, we must improve productivity, we must expand agro-processing and link rural households to markets and value chains. That is where the 24-hour economic program can become practical. Now, let's look at marital status and how that affects poverty. Again, we are very revealing outcomes from the data. Household headed by persons living together in informal unions recorded the highest poverty incidence at 33.1% in quarter 3 of 2025. Informal unions. You are not married. So, I repeat again. So households headed by persons living together in informal unions recorded the highest poverty incidence at 33.1% in quarter 3 of 2025. So informal means you are not married, you are living together as couple. I mean, you haven't done the traditional stuff, or you haven't gone to, you haven't officially cemented your marriage in official circles. So those households headed by people like that, the poverty incidence is very, very high. Now, households headed by divorced persons recorded very low poverty incidence rate at 15.8%. That is not to say that is not to say that those who have been enjoying together through marriage should go through divorce. That's not the message here. And in fact, the poverty rate there is 15.8%. Almost the same as the 15.9% recorded in quarter 2 of 2025. Let me put this differently. If you are living in an informal relationship with your spouse, very informal, that household tend to have poverty of around what? 33%. If you were married, and in the worst case scenario, you got divorced, the poverty rates are better. So in other words, the formal marriage arrangements are still better no matter how you look at it. That's why I emphasize that it doesn't mean that you should go and divorce. All right, this suggests that certain household structures may face higher economic stress, lower stability, and greater vulnerability. Now, one of the most important findings we saw in this study is disability-related vulnerability. Households headed by persons reporting a lot of difficulty had much higher poverty. This is not surprising. For example, poverty incidence was especially high for households that are headed by those with hearing difficulties. In fact, the poverty there, or poverty incidence there was 43%, very high, down from 44% in Q2. So we are seeing some progress, but it's still very minimal. Because if you're talking about national household poverty rate of 21.9%, and you have a group that is exhibiting poverty rate of over 40%, that's very, very high. And also, those who are exhibiting intellectual difficulties recorded poverty rate of around 33.6%, down from 38.8% in Q2. Again, progress there, but the levels, the incidence rates are still high. This is not just a statistic. It's a call to inclusive policy. So disability should not automatically mean poverty. But without accessible services, disability becomes a poverty trap. So when we are bringing in policy interventions to address poverty, it's important to remember that we need to provide services that would be accessible to the people in one way or the other who have some disabilities, so that through that we can improve their poverty incidence. Now, there's a very important indicator, we call it triple burden. In simple language, what does that mean, triple burden? You have households or you have persons that are facing triple burden of multi-dimensional poverty, unemployment, and food insecurity. So in other words, those people are not only multidimensionally poor, but they are also what? Unemployed. And they also face food insecurity situations. So we did an analysis to look at their poverty conditions. Now, in Q3 of 2025, the population 15 years and older who suffered the triple burden I've just mentioned was 1.5%. In numbers, we are talking about 227,500 people who are hit with this triple burden of multidimensional poverty, unemployment, and food insecurity. And this actually is a slight increase from the 208,000 people, or 1.5 persons, recorded in Q2 of 2025. This is a small percentage, but a serious human reality. This is because when these three problems combine, households face extreme vulnerability. The population 15 years and older who were employed, they were not multidimensionally poor, and food secure was 7.7 million, or if you want, 48.2% of the population. So that, again, that's not bad. If you have about half of your population that are not exhibiting employment issues, that are not exhibiting poverty issues, and they are not exhibiting food security issues, that's good. We can do way better, but that's good. And this is up. This has seen some improvement from the 7.1 million, or 46.2%, that was recorded in Q2 of 2025. So this indicates modest welfare gains between Q2 and Q3 of 2025. Now, let's look at the triple burden I just talked about by region. Now, if you look at the data in Q3 of 2025, triple burden was most concentrated in Greater Accra, with about 53,700 people being hit by this triple burden, followed by Ashanti region with about 37,700 people, and then Central region, also about 37,000 people. Together, these three regions account for about 57% of the triple burden population. Now, the Oti region has the least number of triple burdened population of about 1,100, roughly. This reminds us that extreme vulnerability is not only rural. Urban hardship is real as well, especially linked to unemployment and food insecurity. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's break this down to double burden. So in other words, if you pick any of these two at a time, what results do we see? Now, the double burden of food insecurity and multi-dimensional poverty declined. It reduced from 12.5% or 4.1 million people in quarter 2 to 10.9% or 3.6 million people in quarter 3. That is an improvement. And the population that was not poor and food secured also increased from 48.3% in quarter 2 to 50.3% in quarter 3. So in other words, if you're looking at the multi-dimensional poverty and food insecurity, we saw some improvements in households that exhibited both. And then if you look at households that didn't exhibit any of these two, we also saw some improvement. Now let's look at the double burden in poverty and unemployment. Now here, the data shows that it rose from 430,000 persons, or 2.8% in quarter 2, to 483,000 persons, or 3.1% in quarter 3. So whilst we're making some progress with poverty and food insecurity, that's a double effect of poverty and food insecurity. The double effect of poverty and unemployment worsened between the two quarters, with about 430,000 persons exhibiting both in quarter 2, down from, which increased to 483,000 persons in quarter 3 of 2025, or 3.1%. So while poverty is falling overall, unemployed-linked vulnerability is still rising for some groups. That is why I mentioned earlier that job creation must remain very urgent. Across both quarters, the population 15 years and older who were employed and not multidimensionally poor increased marginally from 11.2 million, or 72.7% in quarter 2, to 11.3 million, or 72.9% in quarter 3. Now let's look at the double burden of unemployment and food insecurity. So here we are talking about we are pairing unemployment and food insecurity. This burden remained about 4.9%, or 755,000 in quarter 3, almost the same as what we observed in quarter 2 of 2025. In the same vein, population 15 years and older who were employed and food secured increased from 8.1 million, which is about 52.8% in quarter 2, to 8.5 million, which is 55.1% in quarter 3. So we've seen some improvements in population that are exhibiting the double exhibiting the double burden of unemployment and insecurity. Even when the percentage is stable, the reality is that hundreds of thousands of people are struggling with both food and insecurity, both food insecurity and unemployment at the same time. And that is something that we must confront head on. Now, the key message from this triple burden, double burden, etc., is that some Ghanaians face one hardship, others face two hardships, and we have a smaller group that face three hardships at the same time. And here I'm talking about unemployment, I'm talking about poverty, and I'm talking about what? Food insecurity. So what does that mean? So it means that when we are targeting interventions, we should know that there are people who are facing multiple of these deprivations. And so they are the people we should target first to get them immediately out of poverty. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what are the key takeaways from today's report or presentation or release on our multidimensional poverty exercise? Number one, multidimensional poverty is declining. We see this from the data. The multidimensional poverty incidence reduced from 23.9% in quarter 1 to 21.9% in quarter 3. We've also seen that over 360,000 people actually exited poverty between quarter 2 and quarter 3 of 2025. And if you look at it, if you're looking at it from an annual perspective, we've seen that about 950,000 persons exited poverty between 2024 quarter 3 and 2025 quarter 3. Second, regional inequality remains. We've seen that, for example, Northeast and the Savannah regions continue to record high poverty incidence. In fact, above 50%, when the national average is just 21.9%. But at the same time, we have regions like Greater Accra and Western that are staying below 20%. So that shows the stark inequality we have in poverty. Third, there's a big rural-urban gap. The gap is about 18 percentage points. Rural poverty is about 31.9% compared to urban poverty, that's about 14.2%. Fourth, two dimensions impact poverty the most, and these dimensions are health and living conditions. Health contribution to poverty is about 41%, whilst living conditions contribution to poverty is about 34%. In fact, if you drill down to deprivations or indicators, health insurance coverage contributes about 26.5%, nutrition contributes about 14.5%, and from the living conditions perspective, overcrowding contributes about 8.4%, and toilet deprivations contribute 8%, whilst housing conditions deprivations contribute 5.6%. Number 5, education and stable employment protect households. So we've seen that households that are headed by persons with no education recorded high poverty incidence of about 38.5% compared to those with formal education. For example, tertiary recorded poverty incidence of only 5.7%. So education matters a lot. So the same employment matters. The unemployed, or those households that are headed by people who are not working, recorded very high incidence of poverty at 35.6% compared to those who are employed. For example, public sector recording low incidence of 5.3% and former private sector recording low incidence of what? 5%. Number 6, vulnerable groups remain disproportionately affected. This includes persons with disabilities, we saw that, households and informal unions, we saw that, female-headed households in certain employment vulnerabilities, and households in high poverty regions. We have to deal with these variations or these disparities. Number 7, but not the least, triple burden of unemployment, poverty, and food security. Population increased slightly between quarter 2 and quarter 3 of 2025. In fact, in quarter 2 of 2025, we had about 1.4%, or 208,000 persons, 15 years and above, who suffered that triple burden of unemployment, poverty, and food insecurity. And this number increased slightly to 227,500 persons, or 1.5% in quarter 3 of 2025. So ladies and gentlemen, with this data from this study that the Ghana Statistical Service has embarked on, what recommendations are we giving to government and public institutions, to households, and to the private sector? Now, for government and public institutions, we encourage government to expand the national health insurance coverage and also ensure that we are increasing renewals, or we are providing the environment for renewals to be executed promptly. Second, we recommend that we improve sanitation, including provision of toilet facilities and safe water. That's directly coming from the data. Third, we should strengthen the school feeding program, as well as education support programs. Fourth, we should increase social protection support, like the LEAP, where needed. And we should also scale up skills development, and job creation. After all, we saw the impact of schooling or education and then the impact of employment on poverty. We should also target interventions to the poorest regions and also to the rural areas. We saw that the rural areas exhibited more poverty incidents, higher poverty incidents, and then those without jobs also exhibited higher poverty incidents. Now, for businesses and the private sector, we encourage you to support the National Health Insurance Scheme enrollment, especially for informal workers. We also encourage you to invest in sanitation, water, housing quality, and electricity. Support education access through scholarships, internships, and training. Create more decent jobs and support micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises to grow. We encourage you to design inclusive services and employment opportunities for the vulnerable groups, including persons with disabilities. And for households or individuals like you and I, let's maintain active health insurance coverage, especially NHIS renewal. Let's keep our children in school consistently and reduce or eliminate school lag. Let's improve household nutrition, especially for children. Let's engage in skills and livelihood programs, including apprenticeship. Let's improve living conditions, especially sanitation and overcrowding. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these are very important outcomes or findings from the study, and these recommendations, we believe, would go a long way to actually improve the poverty situation of the country. Before I conclude, let me reaffirm the Ghana Statistical Service's commitments. At the Ghana Statistical Service, we remain committed to producing statistics that are timely, accurate, relevant, and credible. We do this with professionalism, neutrality, and transparency, because evidence-based decisions making is not optional at all. We have to be very intentional about it. It is a foundation for national development. And as Ghana pursues ambitious programs, including the 24-hour program, our role is to ensure that policies are guided by facts, not guesswork. Finally, we express our sincere appreciation. We thank the households across Ghana who provided the data. We thank our hardworking field staff who collected information under very demanding conditions. We thank the government of Ghana and the World Bank and any other institution that funded and supported this work that we did. We thank you, the media, who are always with us to disseminate our work to the general public. And last but not the least, I want us to thank the dedicated staff of the Ghana Statistical Service, many of whom worked overnight to ensure that this report is produced to the highest standards. In conclusion, Ghana is making progress as the data is showing. Multi-dimensional poverty is declining, but the inequality across regions, the rural-urban gap, and the persistence of deprivation in health and living conditions remind us that work is not finished. So let us use this evidence to act, to invest smarter, to target better, and to ensure that every Ghanaian in every region can live with dignity and opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Alassa, for the excellent presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, the multidimensional poverty situation in Ghana for 2025, quarter 2 and 3, have been presented. We want to give